Hello friends, I'm Chadwick and this is Faithful Fullness. We explore the testimony of the biblical prophets and how they perfectly correlate with the current events of today. Thank you for joining us. Friends, in this episode, we're going to discover the prophecies to watch for in the 2020 to 2030 decade. Before we commence, it's important to understand what's the ultimate purpose of watching the prophecies, to understanding what the biblical prophets are saying at a particular time. Well, the ultimate purpose is for the Lord to come back to establish His kingdom, the Jewish kingdom, during the millennium, during the 7,000th year, to fulfill the biblical prophets, to fulfill the Torah. That's the ultimate purpose. And two of the main reasons are to fulfill the everlasting covenants, which is the Abrahamic, the Davidic, and the New Covenant. If you're not familiar with those, the Abrahamic covenant is a promise. It's a unilateral, unconditional, irrevocable promise to Abraham and his descendants. It promised a pure royal lineage seed and also the promised land. Those are two of the major components. So it's the seed and also the promised land. Well, when we go to the Davidic covenant, it just builds and extends upon the Abrahamic covenant. It also is a unilateral, unconditional, and irrevocable promise made to David and his descendants. It did not depend on David. The Abrahamic covenant did not depend on Abraham. Only it depends on God's sovereign righteousness. Okay, so the Davidic covenant says that the seed of the Abrahamic covenant will become the king of the promised land over the children of Israel. So then when we move to the new covenant, which is found in Jeremiah 31, made to the house of Israel and Judah, it basically builds and extends upon the Abrahamic and the Davidic covenant, that it will be the Messiah. He will be the Messiah king over the promised land, over the children of Israel at that time during the millennium. So that's one of the main reasons where we see the biblical prophets, they all look forward to the everlasting covenants being fulfilled by Yeshua, by Jesus, the Messiah. And how do we know that? Is we go to the Gospels and we see that He is the promised seed of the Abrahamic covenant, of the throne of David, which is written in the Gospel of Luke. Luke 1 through 3. Also in Matthew 1, you can see the lineage of the Messiah going back to Abraham and also to also to Adam as well. So it's important to understand that the everlasting covenants, they are prophecies. They are prophecies that has not been fulfilled. The children of Israel has not totally controlled the promised land, and obviously the pure royal lineage seed, Messiah, Yeshua, has not come back for a second coming to fulfill those everlasting covenants. Also, He's coming to fulfill the feast days of the Lord. These are very important. They're very prophetic. They give us an understanding of what's going on at His first coming and also His second coming. They're prophecies as well. So those are two of the main understandings of why we keep up with the biblical prophets before the ultimate fulfillment of His everlasting covenants and also His feast days, which we will continue to celebrate throughout the millennium. If you're not familiar with the Lord's 7 feast days in Leviticus 23, the first 4 were in the spring and summer: Passover, unleavened bread, first fruits, and Shabbat or Pentecost. He was crucified on Passover. He was buried on unleavened bread. He rose on first fruits, and He poured out His Holy Spirit on the feast of Shabbat. So He fulfilled those first 4 feast days to the exact day, hour, and detail of the ceremony. As we know, He's the same yesterday, today, and forever. He does not change. There's no shadow of turning with the Messiah. So if He fulfilled those first 4 spring feasts and summer feasts, then He will fulfill those fall feasts, trumpets, Yom Kippur, and the Feast of Tabernacles at His second coming. The Feast of Trumpets has a lot of idioms with it, but that's with when the Lord will return for His second coming on the Feast of Trumpets. Also, He will 10 days later, after His 10 days of wrath, He will redeem the nation of Israel on the Feast of Yom Kippur, and then 5 days after that is the Feast of Tabernacles, which he will set up his millennial kingdom. So as we can see, this is the ultimate purpose of the biblical prophets, is the everlasting covenants, also the feast days. Those are two of the major factors. And as we can see, that's where the biblical prophets will point us to, is that ultimate restoration of Yeshua to come back for his second coming, to set up his millennial kingdom, restore the Jewish kingdom, and to fulfill the feast days and also the everlasting covenants. So now let's look into some of the prophecies that I believe we could see being sped up, so to speak, or also the velocity of going forward as we go into this next decade. I'm not setting any dates or anything like that, but as you can see as we go through these, we're already seeing movement, a tremendous movement with some of these prophecies. The first I'd like to go through is the Lord's creation plan. This is prophetic as well. The 7-day creation plan, which we're all familiar with. The Lord created the world in 6 days. He rested on the 7th day, so he created this pattern of working 6 and resting on the 7th. In Leviticus 25, he told the children of Israel to work 6 years and rest on the 7th year. So we see this pattern of working 6, resting on the 7th. So when we go back to the days of creation, the 7-day creation plan, that 6 days work, rest on the 7th day. Well, when we go into Psalms 90 and also 2 Peter 3:8, it says that a day is 1,000 years and 1,000 years is a day with the Lord. So what does that tell us? Well, it goes back into the 7-day creation plan. They're prophetic. Isaiah 46 says that the Lord declares the end from the beginning and from ancient times not yet fulfilled. So we have to understand the beginning, the prophetic understanding of the creation days to understand the end. So when we look at these 7-day creation, the 7-day creation plan, we can look at those as 7 days or 7,000 years. So when we calculate this as far as where the history is, it was 4,000 years from Adam to Yeshua, or 4 completed days, and then from Yeshua to now is almost 2 completed days, or 2,000 completed years. If we believe that he was resurrected, crucified and resurrected in AD 30 or AD 33, however you look at it, then we can see that we're almost at that marker, so to speak, on the completion of the 6th day, the completion of the 6,000th year. Again, we're not trying to set dates or anything like that. We just have to watch these other prophecies that we're about to mention, and then we'll understand where we fit in on the 7-day creation plan prophetically, if you will. Now let's look at some of the prophecies, and we're going to look at all these in summary. We've done videos on most of these prophecies in detail, so you can go to my website or my YouTube channel, but we'll look at some of these in just a very summarized manner, and then we'll kind of look at today's world to see how that fits, and then we can kind of look forward in the next decade to see what's going on. And the one that kind of sticks out to me right now is the book of Daniel. I believe the book of Daniel is being unsealed as we speak. I believe it started being unsealed pretty much once the turn of the millennium to this year 2000. I believe we started seeing tremendous movement when we look back 20 years ago. We've just seen this movement along, and especially the last 10 years, especially the last 5 years, we've seen tremendous movement with the book of Daniel and the 4 major kingdoms. I always tell people it's the basic way to understand that we live at the time of the end. It's the most basic way, and there's a few other markers that we can keep up with as well. As when the nation of Israel was established, them recapturing Jerusalem. That was in 48 when they became a nation. 1967 is when they recaptured Jerusalem. Those were tremendous markers on the Lord's timetable, as we'll see in some of the prophecies. Also, with the return of the Jewish people to the Promised Land, that's another marker that the Lord is going to return, because he will not return until they say, "Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord." So they have to be in Jerusalem to do that. So those are just some of the basic markers, but I also believe that the 4 kingdoms of Daniel are the basic way for us to understand. I believe Messiah points to them as well, and we'll get to that. Kingdom against kingdom, nation against nation. Also, he points us to the abomination of desolation in Daniel. So he points us back to the book of Daniel for insight, for wisdom, for knowledge of the end of the age. And he commands all of us to watch. He specifically said to watch, so that he does not come upon us as a thief in the night. As we know, he comes as a thief in the night to the ones who are dead, the dead church, the lukewarm church, but the faithful church, the ones who are watching, he will not come upon them as a thief in the night. You can read that in Thessalonians 5, also in Revelation 1 through 3 on those churches. So the Daniel's 4 kingdoms are very important. You can find those in Daniel 2 and also in Daniel 7. I believe they mirror each other. I do not believe those have been fulfilled. The book of Daniel in Daniel 12:4 says the book is sealed until the time of the end. Well, the time of the end is the time of the end. So we're starting to see the end of the age. We're starting to see these prophecies, these kingdoms starting to rise and fall, just like the prophet states. This is for the end of the age. Daniel 2 is for the end of the age as well. In Daniel 2:28 it says that Nebuchadnezzar, the dream was for the end of the age, for the latter times these things will come true. He wanted Nebuchadnezzar to understand that, also Daniel and his 3 friends. So we have to understand that Daniel 2, Daniel 7, and Daniel 8, and the book of Daniel prophetically, when it's talking about these beasts or these kingdoms, that they're for the end of the age. If you're not familiar with Daniel 2 has a statue. It was King Nebuchadnezzar. He dreamt of a statue of 4 kingdoms, and then there was going to be the 5th kingdom, which is Messiah. Okay, and again, like we said in Daniel 2:28, it says this is for the latter time or the end of the age. In Daniel 2:44 and 45, it says, in the days of those kings, those 4 kings, that Messiah would come and he would crush them all at that time. Of course, he did not come back at the time of Nebuchadnezzar, Cyrus, and Alexander the Great, but he will come back once those kingdoms are to their fulfillment at the end of the age. So when we go through it, Daniel mentions that Babylon is the first kingdom. And then we go forward in the progression. We have a prophetic foreshadow of what happened in history. Babylon, Medo-Persia, Yavon, and then there's going to be a conglomerate. So Daniel 7's the same one. It's 4 kingdoms. And to summarize those, it will be Iraq, which is Babylon, Iran, which is Persia, Greece or Yavon will be Turkey, and then there's going to be a conglomerate. So how do we know that? Well, we go to Revelation 13, 1 through 2, and it says that John says he saw a beast, and it was a bear, a leopard, and a lion. So he takes us back to Daniel 7's 3 kingdoms, the first 3 kingdoms, and then those 3 kingdoms will be the conglomerate, the land area of those ancient Babylonian, Medo-Persian, and Grecian or Yavon empires, if you will. And again, I did a detailed study on these, and you can find that on my YouTube page and also my website. It goes through details, but we have to understand there's going to be 4 kingdoms that rise to power. Their modern names, we can locate them in the areas of Iraq, Iran, Turkey, and then the conglomerate area of the Middle East and North Africa. So when we look at history in the last 20 years, in 2003, Babylon or Iraq, it fell with Saddam Hussein. Well, then since that time, Iran, which is Medo-Persia, has come to power, and there's not a military leader, a political leader, or a religious leader, or anyone who keeps up in the geopolitical arena in that area that cannot tell you that Iran is not the dominant superpower of the Middle East. So just like Daniel prophesied in his 4 kingdoms, Iraq has fallen, Babylon. Now we're seeing Iran or Medo-Persia in the Bible. They are the superpower of the Middle East. And then we have the next one, Turkey or Yavon. It says Greece in the Bible, but we have Turkey coming to power. And whenever we look at the Middle East today, we've seen Turkey and its leader, Recep Tayyip Erdogan, the president of Turkey, making his move for superiority of the Middle East. He's invaded Syria in 2016. He invaded Syria on the 500th anniversary of when the first Sultan invaded the big Syria, and after that the first Sultan controlled the Middle East. So history will repeat itself. He went into the big Syria in 2016. He's clamped down on the people in Turkey ever since then with the elections, and almost has formed it as a tyrannical dictatorship of the previous Ottoman Empire, if you will, with what he has done over there. You can do your research yourself on that, and you'll see what he has done. And now he has recently invaded Syria even more, and with this border to push the Kurdish people over to Iran. We've done a video on that. So you're seeing this movement of the third kingdom of Turkey for superiority of the Middle East, and that brings us to Daniel 8. Okay, Daniel 2 and Daniel 7 were the four major kingdoms. Okay, it gives you them in sequence. And then we have Daniel 8, which tells you the transition of the second kingdom to the third kingdom. And this is very important. This is the prophecy that really sticks out to me, but it also fulfills Daniel 2 and Daniel 7 because of what we just mentioned with the four kingdoms. But it just gives you the detail of how the transition will be from the second kingdom to the third kingdom. Unlike Iraq falling, you're going to see a major war between Iran and Turkey, Iran being the second kingdom, Turkey being the third kingdom. You're going to see a major war in Daniel 8 from what it says, and Turkey will win that war. From what Gabriel has, the angel Gabriel, the messenger of the interpretation of the passage, he tells us that Turkey will win this war. Okay, so we're starting to see the movement of Turkey, and it's represented by a goat in the prophecy, and it will come against the ram or Iran, and he will crush him, he will smash him, he will gain victory over him, and Turkey will control the Middle East. They will be the superior nation at that time once this is fulfilled. And I believe you're starting to see the movement. And it's interesting when you look at the President of the United States, the last two presidents, Barack Obama built up Iran. During his tenure. He gave him $150 billion in the nuclear deal, also $1.5 billion in cash on a pallet, which is pretty amazing when you think about it. But he built up Iran. But then when Trump has come into office, he's gone against Iran, and he's opened the door for Turkey to gain superiority in the Middle East, like we said, pulling out of Syria, which was I do not agree with, but he pulled out of Syria, and he's left the door for Turkey to do as he pleases, if you will, and push the Kurdish people out of their land, also to gain victory also in Syria over Assad, etc. And I believe you're going to see that anticipate more and more, accelerate, more and more to fulfillment. And then you see what happened with Iran these last couple of weeks with the General Soleimani being assassinated by President Trump and the American government. So you're seeing Iran really almost to its peak, if you will. Some believe that they're going to do a military excursion across the Middle East, and they very well could also. But since Iraq fell, Iran has gone in with major influence in these proxy groups across the Middle East. Now, they might do a military excursion as well, of course, but they have major influence, just like the prophecy states. They go northward, southward, and westward in the prophecy, and they certainly have done that with influence in Yemen, with the proxies and with the Houthis in Yemen, also in Iraq. They have major influence there. Also in Syria, they've propped up Assad as well with major influence they have with him. The proxy group Hezbollah is under Iran and Lebanon, and also in Hamas, they're a proxy group for Iran as well. So they have spread their antennas, if you will, across the Middle East, and we'll see if they do a military excursion in the future with that, because we've already seen the Turkey movement, if you will, and there's going to be a major clash between those two countries. So as we go forward in the 2020s, I believe you're going to see this war come to fulfillment. That's my personal opinion. I'm not predicting, but you're just seeing the major movement with this. And just to be clear, Erdogan, the president of Turkey, has said that his goal is for 2023 for the revived Ottoman Empire. So I didn't say that, but he said that numerous times, that his goal is for 2023 to reestablish the land areas of the Middle East, if you will, what the ancient Ottoman Empire controlled. And then he's also has sent troops into Libya, which is very interesting, because in Daniel 11, it says that Libya is one of the countries that the Antichrist dominates, it subdues, it conquers, along with Egypt and Sudan. So I just find that interesting. No, I do not believe that Erdogan is the Antichrist, but it's just interesting. You're seeing these movements with these certain countries, these foreshadows of what's to come in the future by the lawless one, by the man of sin. And I just find that interesting, since I believe that the Antichrist will come from that Assyrian area, the king of the north, the Turkey area, that regional area of Assyria, Turkey, Iraq area. It's just interesting that he sent troops over into Libya here recently in the past couple weeks. So we're seeing a lot of movement in this prophecy in Daniel 8, which also again fulfills Daniel 2 and Daniel 7. So we're seeing these four major kingdoms come into power, and we're seeing them rise to power. We're seeing them being dethroned, just like Messiah said, kingdom against kingdom, nation against nation. So it's just important to watch Turkey and Iran and see how that works out in the future, because we understand that Turkey will conquer and will dominate and smash Iran, and then Iran will fall underneath the Turkish Empire, the revived Ottoman Empire, if you will. Okay, now we'll move into another prophecy that I believe that we're going to start to see here soon gain a lot of speed. I think we've already started seeing it. I've written my second book about it. It's called, it's the prophecy of the fishermen and the hunters. It's a prophecy in Jeremiah 16, and I'll paraphrase it for you in summary that basically there's going to be a time where God sends for many fishermen to fish the children of Israel, the Jewish people, back home. And then also after that, once that gets to a certain point, he's going to send the hunters to hunt them back. It's a prophecy in Jeremiah 16, so it has not been fulfilled, because through their exiles, when they were exiled to Babylon, they were not fished back first. Cyrus allowed them to go back, but they weren't fished back to their promised land like the prophecy states. Also, when they were exiled out of the when the Romans destroyed the city and they were exiled, then they were not fished back as well. But since after that time in 1948, when they were established as a state again, that's when the prophecy, I believe, started to gain speed and started its fulfillment as the fishermen. God's fishermen are his own people, the Jewish people. They are the fishermen. In Romans 11, it says they are the elect. They, as a majority, they might be the enemies of the gospel at the current time, not for long, but at the current time. But for the promises, for the Abrahamic covenant, they are the elect, and they are going to fish their own people back. And you're seeing that since 1948. You're seeing tremendous speed upon the fishermen fishing their own people back through the government, also through networks like the Aliyah Return Center. I have a friend of mine who does that, and also all of these organizations that are fishing their people back. And since 1948, there's been over 3 million people who have made Aliyah, or the return back to the promised land. Again, it is a confirmation that we're living at the end of the age, because that's one of the markers, is Israel and the Jewish people returning back to the promised land. So Jeremiah 16, the fishermen have been released, in my opinion, in 1948. And now you're starting to see the hunters being released, in my opinion. And it is interesting that some of the celestial bodies in the sky, the moon, in Psalms 89, it says the moon is the faithful witness in the sky. In Psalms 104, it says it declares the set times, the appointed times. And I'm not sure if you're familiar with the blood moon, but it's a lunar eclipse. And basically, there's been 4 times in the last 500 years that these blood moons have fallen on the Lord's feast days of Passover and Sukkot, okay? And we'll go through those real quick. And the reason I'm telling you this is because every time that's happened, there's been an aliyah, there's been a movement of the Jewish people when these blood moons have fallen on the Lord's feast days, the tetrad, if you will. That means 4 consecutive blood moons. Passover Tabernacles, Passover Tabernacles. And the first one was in 1492, okay, and that's when the Spanish Inquisition was. There was a movement, there was a migration of the Jewish people from Spain. There was blood moons in 1493 and 1494 on Passover and Tabernacles. The next one is 1948. We know that's when the state of Israel became a nation, the state again. What happened? There was blood moons on 1949 and 1950 on the Feast of Passover, the Feast of Tabernacles, both years. There was a movement back to the Promised Land. Okay, then we get to 1967. Again, that's when they recaptured Jerusalem as their capital. Well, what occurred? We had blood moons, 1967, 1968 on the Feast of Passover, the Feast of Tabernacles on both years. So we're seeing this pattern, if you will, of movement on these blood moons on the Lord's feast days. And I believe it's very significant because we've seen this movement on them. And I believe the fishermen in Jeremiah's prophecy began in 1948. Of course, it makes logical sense because how can you fish your people back if you're not a state again? So they became a state in 1948. And then the fishermen started fishing their people back. And like I said, there's been over 3 million Jewish people return home. So now let's get to the fourth one. The fourth one occurred in 2014 and 2015 on the Feast of Passover, the Feast of Tabernacles. Again, we had blood moons, 4 consecutive moons in a row on those two feast days. And what occurred? We had the Aliyah coming from the hunters. The hunters were released into Europe. I'm not sure if you've kept up with that, but if you go back into 2014, 2015, that's when the Islamic invasion, if you will, a lot of the refugees migrated into Europe, and that's when all the terror became just widespread throughout those 2 years, and it provoked the Jewish people to go home. So just like the prophecy states, he's going to send the fishermen first, like he did in 1948. It's going to allow that to happen, and then on his appointed time, which I believe are where the moons are, with the appointed times in Psalms 104, then the hunters were released, the beginning of it, in 2014, 2015. Now, both fishermen and hunters will continue to move as we go forward in the 2020s. Of course, they're still fishing the people back home to Israel, the Jewish people. And then also, I believe the hunters will gain a lot of speed. I believe in this next decade, you're going to start to see the terror and the war to provoke the Jewish people to go back to the Promised Land, just like Jeremiah 16 states. Now, how can we look at that? Well, in Europe, it's interesting, they had the third largest population of the Jewish people. So it came to Europe first because it's right close to the Middle East. And now you're starting to see anti-Semitism. You're starting to see hatred in America because America has the second largest population of the Jewish people. So you're going to start to see the escalation of this prophecy, in my opinion, in the next decade and further in America, in Europe, and all parts of the world to provoke the Jewish people to go home to the Promised Land, just like the prophecy states. So we all need to keep the Jewish people in prayer, that they listen to the Lord, they become a believer in Yeshua, and then they listen to the Lord to be provoked back to the Promised Land, which we all one day want to be in the Promised Land. So I believe Jeremiah 16 is a very important prophecy. It's very sobering prophecy. I did write my second book about the prophecy, and it goes through this in great detail of the blood moons, who are the fishermen, who are the hunters throughout history, who are these people that have all come against the Jewish people. And we're starting to see that with Islam. Again, they're the ones who are going to be the specific primary hunters that's going to provoke the Jewish people to return home. When you look at Europe, when you're starting to see America, okay, look at the Congress, look at the anti-Semitism in our Congress and all across our land where Islam is starting to gain a foothold, so to speak. So we're going to be doing a book series on the book here next year and in the 2020 season. So we will get more detailed about that prophecy. So now let's move forward to Zechariah 1. Zechariah 1 is another prophecy that I believe we're going to start to see major speed with here in this decade. It basically goes through the repentance of the Jewish people. At the beginning, it's a call. Zechariah calls the Jewish people to repentance. And first of all, I believe that Zechariah is an end of the age book. I believe it's very prophetic. Even the foreshadows that it might seem that it was already fulfilled, I believe they will come true again. It's the prophetic foreshadows, if you will. So I do believe that this prophecy is very important. And basically, it's calling the children of Israel to repentance. Okay, and it's got these foreshadows in it that I think we can relate to where we're living in now. The prophecy, in summary, it calls them to repentance, and then it's on the calendar of trees. I don't know if you're familiar with the calendar of trees, but it talks about the 24th day of the month of Shevat, okay? Well, the calendar of trees is Shevat 15, okay? So it goes through this calendar of trees, and it's just like in America, we have a school schedule or a school year, a fiscal year. Well, the Jewish people have 4 calendars actually they go by. And this one calendar, they have a religious calendar, a civil calendar, and then this one is the tree calendar where they plant trees for the year. So this prophecy is about trees and is symbolic for the Jewish people. It's talking about the myrtle trees, which I believe represent the Jewish people. And then the prophecies in the month of Shevat, which is where the calendar of trees begins. And we have this red horse, which we all know red symbolizes war, symbolizes terror. Okay, and it kind of works with the Jeremiah 16 prophecy of the hunters, in my opinion. I do believe that this prophecy is going to gain some speed, but it mentions that it's in the second year of a Gentile superpower. Well, at that time it was Darius. He was the Gentile superpower of the time. Well, and now if we look at Trump in the American government, this is the Gentile superpower of today. Well, what's so interesting is on the second year of Donald Trump's inauguration, there was a blood moon, okay, on the calendar of trees in 2018. And then you had July 27th, which was Tu B'Av, which is kind of like the Valentine's Day of love for the Jewish people. There was a blood moon on that. And then on Tu B'Shavat again, which is the calendar of trees, you can think of it as January and February. On January 20th, there was another blood moon on the same day. So there was 3 blood moons, and I do believe that was a warning to Trump not to divide the land in the deal of the century, but I also believe it was markers for what's to come with the red horse, if you will, or the hunters in Jeremiah 16. So it's just something to look for, because the prophecy ends with the Lord being zealous for Jerusalem, Him being zealous for Zion, wanting Yeshua to build His temple during the millennial kingdom. It's not the temple that's about to be built, it's Yeshua building the temple for the Lord when you read Zechariah 1. So I believe Zechariah 1 and Jeremiah 16 correlate together, okay, and also with the prophetic understanding that the blood moons do mean judgment or do mean movement, just like we discussed before with the pattern that we've seen with the 4 tetrads that occurred in the last 500 years. This is not a major feast day, but Tu B'Shavat is the calendar of trees. Tu B'Av is the Valentine's Day of love, and I do believe they can correlate, and they were markers of what's to come. And now when we look at the red horse, and the red flags of Iran, I'm not sure if that means the red horse or not, but we can kind of tell with Jeremiah 16, with the hunters, with the anti-Semitism in America, in Europe, and all the other places in the world. You're starting to see this war, this terror that's going to provoke His people, the Jewish people, back home to the Promised Land. So I do believe Zechariah 1 is another prophecy just to look forward to, and just to read and to meditate and to pray about, and that sort of thing. Also, the next thing we'll go to is in the prophet of Isaiah. In Isaiah 17 and Isaiah 19, we just finished a couple of videos on Isaiah 17 and Isaiah 19. I believe they're ultimately the day of the Lord is when those will be fulfilled. I believe we're starting to see the movement of them, just like we've discussed in the videos. We've seen Isaiah 17 since the civil war began in 2011 in Syria. Over the last decade, it's just been a nightmare there. It's been refugees, misplacement. It's been a disaster, a humanitarian disaster over there. So obviously we need to keep those folks in prayer, their families in prayer, and they come to the gospel. They come to Yeshua, but you're starting to see Syria become an upheaval, civil unrest, if you will. Like we've discussed, Turkey has invaded Syria, and they're gaining major major control over the area. Iran's got influence with Assad over there. So you're starting to see Syria have that fulfillment, if you will, of this prophecy. But I believe it's for the day of the Lord is when it will be destroyed completely, because remember, it has northern Israel in there too. So it's Damascus, but also northern Syria is what will be judged and chastised by the Lord. I believe that will be fulfilled at the day of the Lord, at his return. Also in Isaiah 19, we'll move on forward to that, which is the judgment against Egypt. It's also the restoration of Egypt. Remember, in the prophecy, he hands them over to an evil king, just like we spoke before. Egypt is one of the three kings that the Antichrist conquers, with Libya and also Sudan. So it's important to understand this prophecy is gaining a lot of speed as well, with the economical disaster that's coming, and also the ecological disaster with the dams that they've been building in the Nile River that will cause an ecological disaster for the people. So it's important to see Isaiah 17, also in Isaiah 19, and as we've seen in the prophecy, there's going to be a beautiful highway from Isaiah 17 to also, from Assyria to Egypt, this beautiful highway during the millennium. So we need to obviously keep those folks in prayer and just keep an eye on these two prophecies, Isaiah 17, Isaiah 19, because you're starting to see the movement of them with the details of what's going to happen before the day of the Lord comes. It gives us these instances, these crises, if you will, of what's going to come before the day of the Lord. Okay, now a prophecy to also keep in mind is Daniel 9. We all know what Daniel 9 states, that it speaks of the Antichrist confirming an agreement, the peace deal, in Daniel 9:27. Then he'll break it midway through the 7 years, which is the 3.5 mark, which is the abomination of desolation that Messiah speaks of. I believe we could see this prophecy gain tremendous speed. It also depends, I believe, on the deal of the century, or some deal out there that the Antichrist confirms. Remember, he doesn't make one, he confirms and establishes an agreement that is already in place. So could that be the deal of the century, or could that be another deal? Certainly, we just have to keep our eyes watching. But once we see a deal made, that we could possibly see, whether it's the Jewish temple being in the deal or whatever it may be, we're going to see movement on this prophecy as well. And again, it goes along with the Daniel prophecies of the 4 major kingdoms. It goes with the Jeremiah 16, the Zechariah 1. It goes along with all of these prophecies fit together like a puzzle. So that's why we could just keep watching all of these prophecies, because they're all going to work together on God's appointed time, and they're going to work perfectly together. But I believe you could see an agreement being made somewhere, somehow, that the Antichrist will confirm when he arises at the appointed time that the Lord chooses. So it's important to read Daniel 9, also keep an eye on the deal of the century that Trump has, and also the other deals that could be coming. And again, they will set one in place, and then when he rises, he will confirm. He will not rise until Turkey becomes great. Okay, this is Daniel 8. Again, it goes back into what I just said with understanding all the prophecies coming together. He will not rise to power until Daniel 8, until Turkey smashes Iran, and then the leader of Turkey, in this case it will be Erdogan, until he dies. Okay, and then there will be 4 regions, and then he will rise to power. So that's why you have to keep an eye on the Daniel prophecies as well, because they all work together to understand when the lawless one, when the Antichrist will rise to power. Yes, we will see him rise. We will not be raptured until the day of the Lord, the last day of the tribulation. Just like Messiah says in Matthew 24, immediately after the tribulation. And he says after the tribulation, that means the last day of the tribulation, he will come, and that's when we will be resurrected before he pours out his 10 days of wrath from Feast of Trumpets to the Feast of Yom Kippur, and then he'll set up his kingdom on the Feast of Tabernacles. So it's important to understand that and realize that the Jewish temple will be a part of this somehow, some way, in this deal or another deal, and we just need to keep our eyes focused and see how all these things pan out. And I believe we're going to see tremendous movement in the next 10 years, the next decade, on these prophecies. Okay, now we'll get to the Olivet Discourse. It is a prophetic sermon that he that he gave, Messiah, before he was crucified, resurrected. Matthew 24, Mark 13, Luke 21. And we'll just go through some of the bullet points to see, are we starting to see these things? And it's important to realize that he says, once you see all of these things come at once, there can't be one, there can't be one or two come true. All of these things occurring at one time are the beginning of sorrows. And then we'll get into the tribulation period and then the day of the Lord when he returns. So we'll go through a couple of these bullet points, but I think we can all look around and see, he says, do not be deceived. The deception will be tremendous. And I believe that deception, there's a lot of folks out there that are deceived. Number one, the Muslims are deceived. There's 1.5 billion, 1.7 billion Muslims that are deceived. We've got the Orthodox Jewish people, the ultra-Orthodox, the secular Jewish people that are deceived. We got Gentiles that are deceived. So we even have Christians that are deceived in certain denominations and things like that. So deception, we can check that off as yes, we're starting to see the deception. And I believe it's only going to get very stronger. It's going to get really stronger as the days proceed. Wars, he says nation against nation, kingdom against kingdom. Certainly, we've discussed that before. You look at the Middle East, look at since 2003, when Iraq fell, it's been a disaster. It's been a nation against nation, kingdom against kingdom, civil unrest, revolutions in the Arab Spring. So we're starting to see that, and we'll continue to see that with Iran and Turkey as well. Also, he says famines, diseases, and earthquakes. I put this in my first book. We're starting to see the velocity of them. Especially since 1948, we've seen the velocity of these things coming more and more as time goes by. The famines, the diseases, the pestilences, all of these things that Messiah warned about, we've started to see those come in droves. We started seeing them in velocity. Also, he says there's going to be the rumbling of the seas, the waves. We can equate that to hurricanes and also tsunamis. We've started to see, more of those and the catastrophic hurricanes that I know America received 3 of those in 2017. 2017, I believe. We had 3 major hurricanes that devastated the southeastern United States and throughout the Caribbean. Also the tsunamis we see in the Asian countries as well. So we're starting to see, again, all of these things. We can make a case that we're starting to see them all at once come to fruition. Also, we have false prophets. We have tremendous amounts of false prophets that are arising. Again, Messiah warned it in Matthew 24, Luke 21, Mark 13. We're seeing a lot of false prophets, and we'll continue to see a lot rise up in the future, and especially the main false prophet that is written in the book of Revelation. Also, Messiah says that the love of many will grow cold. I think we're seeing that. Everyone's really kind of focused on their life and their achievements and their goals and their aspirations. And the love of many really has grown cold. It's really kind of like a self-oriented world. With social media and things like that, it's really become self, instead of loving the Lord God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and also loving your neighbor, which are the 2 greatest commandments that fulfills all of the Torah. So I do believe we can check that off as well. And then it says that the gospel will be spread throughout the whole world. I believe, obviously, with technology, also with the mission, the brave missionaries, they have spread the gospel throughout the world. I believe we can make the case that we are pretty close to it being spread through all 4 corners of the earth. It says the days of Noah, the days of Lot. Messiah warned, that's part of the checklist as well for Messiah in the Olivet Discourse. We're starting to see that as well. The days of Lot, the days of Noah, people doing what they wish, marrying, getting drunk, all these things that Messiah says no one's really paying attention to the biblical prophets or paying attention to the Olivet Discourse. And that reverts you back to the prophets. So we can make the case for that has been fulfilled as well. And then it says that enemies will surround Israel. I don't believe that is totally fulfilled, but when you look at a map, they are surrounded in the nations around Israel. We've got Israel, and then we've got Islamics. the Islamic nations, the radical Islamic nations around them. Now, there will be a time where they come into the land of Israel and surround Jerusalem. That time has not come yet, obviously, but as we can see, Satan has definitely worked on the outer regions of Israel to form that coalition, those 10 kings to come against the promised land, against Israel at the appointed time. And then he says about the fig tree. We're all familiar with the fig tree parable. The fig tree parable is found in Matthew, in all of the accounts of Matthew 24, Luke 21, Mark 13. And it basically speaks to this fig tree. There's a lot of believers that equate that with the state of Israel being formed in 1948. You can do what you wish with that, agree or not agree with it. But if it is the case in 1948, and then Moses tells us that 70 years are of a man's life, and then 80 if we're strong, well, you can do the calculations yourself. That puts us in this decade of seeing these things starting to be fulfilled tremendously. So again, not setting dates, but just honestly looking at the prophecies, looking at what Moses stated, what Messiah stated. We're all trying to look at these things to understand, not to come up with a specific date, but to understand the season that we're living in so that we can get the gospel out to people, number one, and also to warn people, just like Messiah says, to watch. And it goes back into the wise and foolish versions of the Olivet Discourse in Matthew 25, the warning to pay attention, the warning to keep your oil, obviously to keep your flame lit, to be the light of the world until the true light of the world comes back for his second coming in his millennial kingdom. So it's very important to understand the Olivet Discourse, and he's going to revert you back to the biblical prophets, to the Torah, to the prophets, to understand the times, the seasons that we live in. I have to mention 2 Thessalonians 2, 1 through 3 as well. It kind of goes with the love of many will grow cold. It's called the great apostasy that Paul writes about in 2 Thessalonians 2, 1 through 3. And then the Son of Man is revealed. Of course, there's going to be a great apostasy. There's going to be a great falling away. And then the son of perdition, the sinful man, the Antichrist, the final hunter, if you will. He will rise to power at that time. But there's going to be a falling away. It's through the deception that Messiah mentioned in Matthew 24. There's going to be lovers of themselves. Men's going to be lovers of themselves, doing their own thing. And you can kind of see our world going to that on steroids, if you will, with the social media, with the achievements, with the self-idolatry that is going on in the world about me, instead of about the gospel, and the kingdom of God. Another prophecy I think we should mention before we close here is Romans 11. Romans 11, most know it as the grafted in prophecy, if you will, and we're all grafted into the Israel of God. And I want to mention on the everlasting covenants, if you're a Gentile, you're no longer a Gentile once you're saved by Yeshua, Jesus. You're no longer a Gentile. In Ephesians 2, 11 through 13, you're part of the commonwealth of Israel of God, as far as what Paul writes. And also in Galatians 3, 26 through 29, it says that if you are a seed of Christ, you are a seed of Abraham, and you are heir according to the promise. Well, the promise is the Abrahamic covenant. So there is no Jew, there is no Gentile, there is no male, there is no female. Once you're saved in Yeshua, you're into the commonwealth of Israel of God, and you are heirs according to the promises, the Abrahamic, the Davidic, and the New Covenant. And also the feast days are important to understand as well, to not celebrate according to the man traditions that Gentiles have inherited. So it's very important to understand that. But in Romans 11, you see this grafted in, that we're all grafted into the tree. And there's 2 points I want to come up with. Number one, it says that we should be examples to the Jewish people who are not believers, to make them jealous. Well, that goes back into what I just said. We need to present a Jewish Jesus, a Yeshua, Jesus' name in Hebrew, to the Jewish people, and not the pagan practices. We need to be keeping Shabbat, which is on Saturday, not Sunday. We need to be keeping the feast days of the Lord instead of the festivals of mankind or the Roman Catholic Church. We cannot make them jealous if we're doing things that are against the Torah and against the prophets, with some of the ways that we celebrate the festivals and things like that of Jesus. So we need to understand that. We need to make them jealous. And I truly believe that we are starting to see that movement upon Gentiles as to going back to the original faith, the original revelation of Torah, the prophets, worshiping the way that the Lord wants us to, and not the way that man has commanded throughout the church, the Catholic Church, on through the Protestant Church. There's a lot of idolatry in there that are against the Ten Commandments and against what the Torah and the prophet says. So that's one of the points I want to see. And I'm starting to see Gentiles. Number one, I'm starting to see Jewish people come to Yeshua as their Savior, and then I'm starting to see Gentiles come to their Jewish faith the way that Messiah would have worshipped himself and is worshiping, and that we will worship in the millennial kingdom, okay, with the feast days, etc. That's what we will be doing, not according to man. So we're starting to see that movement in the prophecy, but also the fullness of the Gentiles. There's a lot of debate on what this means. Some believe that when the last Gentile accepts Messiah as their Savior, that's the fullness of the Gentiles. A better translation would be the maturity of the Gentiles. And what I just mentioned, that once we're saved in Yeshua, we're starting to throw off the practices of mankind, throw off those Gentile celebrations, those pagan practices, and we're going to the fullness or the maturation of the Gentiles to be that example, to make the Jews jealous in Romans 11, just like Paul commanded us to not boast, but to make them jealous, because we were a wild olive, now we're grafted in, and obviously we want to be a light and be the salt of the earth to not only Jews, but also Gentiles that are not saved as well. Last but not least, I want to mention this episode that happened in 2015, and I want to be very careful with this. It's just very interesting. Most of us are very familiar with Genesis 41, about Pharaoh's dream about the 7 years of plenty and the 7 years of famine. Well, I want to mention this, and Jonathan Cahn presented this in 2015. He did some research on this, and he showed it on television that there was a cow that appeared in America right before the Shemitah year. If you're not familiar with the Shemitah years, every 7th year is the Shemitah year, and it has very significance to the prophecies. And for example, the time of Jacob's trouble, the 7-year tribulation period, will begin on the Shemitah year, and it will end on the Shemitah year. It's the sevens. It goes back into Daniel's 70th week. It's all about the sevens with the Lord. So he presented this information. I just want to pass it along if you haven't heard about it. But in 2015, right before the Shemitah year, I believe that is in 2016, and the Shemitah will begin on the Feast of Trumpets. Okay, and that's you can think about that in the fall and September, October area. But on the Feast of Trumpets, on the civil calendar, is when it begins. So anyhow, at that time, right at the Shemitah year, or before the Shemitah year, there was a good cow that was on the earth, and it had a perfect number 7 on its head. And you can see it for yourself, but there's a perfect number 7 on this cow's head. And then a few weeks later, there was another cow that presented on the earth that had an ugly number 7. So the rabbinical thought of this, and what Jonathan Cahn and myself were personally looking into, if you will, myself, is, could it be Joseph's interpretation of Pharaoh's dream? We're all familiar with that dream of 7 good years, 7 bad years, and they will be on the Shemitah calendar. Again, God declares the end from the beginning, and from ancient times not yet fulfilled. This is a prophetic foreshadow that I believe will come true whenever that time is at the end of the age. I believe we're living at the end of the age. But this, I believe, will be a prophetic foreshadow that will come true for the world. When you look at the book of Revelation and you see where people can't buy food without the mark of the beast, etc., with the global economy going down, this dream will come true at some time. This ultimate fulfillment, not only on Genesis 41 at Pharaoh's time and Joseph's time, but also at the end of the age, in my personal opinion. So anyhow, I wanted to share this with you. I believe that the Shemitah began in 2016 And we've been in this 7 years of plenty. I don't think anybody could debate that since the elections in America with President Trump. Whether you hate him or love him, it doesn't matter. But the economy has been terrific, in America and other parts of the world, to where you can see that you can make the case that we're living in the 7 years of plenty. So if we take 7 years, and that comes about 2023, or if you think it's 2024, whenever you think the next Shemitah cycle is, could it be the 7 years of famine that would lead you into the time of Jacob's trouble, pretty much, and it goes back into the days of creation, the 7 days of creation. And again, I'm very careful. I don't want to set any kind of dates or anything like this, but I do believe that the Lord gives us this understanding to prepare. We need to be like the wise, like the sons of Issachar. We need to be, in Proverbs it says, a wise man sees things and he prepares. He prepares. It says that the foolish they go into destruction because their lack of instruction as well. So we need to understand these things, and I'm not saying that these cows are prophetic. I'm not saying that's where we are, but it's just something to pray about. It's something to look into and see if it resonates with you or not, to prepare, to help others to understand, because there will be a time coming when the world economy will not be good. Even in America, it will not be good. We've been through those times in 2008 here. We've been through those times throughout the history of America, and it seems like every 7 years it occurs, so to speak. But we did miss it the last time, and are we going to see that come to fruition in the early 2020s when that next Shemitah cycle occurs? So I just wanted to share that with you. I'm not saying it will happen, it won't happen. It's just something, again, to watch for, just like these other prophecies. We just need to watch these things, pay attention to all of these prophecies, because we are living at the greatest time in human history since the Messiah's first coming. There's no question about that. And I believe it's an awesome time, but also a terrible time, just like the prophet Joel says, the awesome and terrible day of the Lord. He says it's awesome, but also terrible. And I believe we're in the same circumstance, that it's going to be awesome for the believers to see these things that a lot of people would love to have witnessed over the last 2,000 years, and you and I have a front row seat to see the biblical prophets come off the page into reality to be fulfilled. So I wanted to leave you with that we need to be searching the prophets, we need to be searching the Torah, understanding what Messiah commanded us and taught us prophetically as well. Also what Paul wrote about in all the letters of what they wrote about to prepare us for this time. That's why they wrote it. And I always tell people that they're not called historians, they're called prophets. Even though some of it was history, a lot of it are prophetic foreshadows. And just like we know, history repeats itself. And so does God's Bible, His Holy Bible. It will repeat itself with these scenarios, these prophets, these understanding of the things, so that the believers who are watching, the wise virgins, we can prepare other people to have oil in their lamps, so they can be the light of the world to people as well, because we're starting to see this massive movement, this paradigm shift in the biblical prophets, in the spirit of a lot of believers, to cast away a lot of strongholds, to cast away a lot of addictions, to cast away the world, the worldly ways, the worldly lust, the lust of the eyes, lust of the flesh, the pride of life. And I believe we're in this major transition in year 5780 of the Jewish calendar. And 2020, we need to have 2020 vision. I've been hearing that and seeing that on Facebook and social media, that 2020 vision. Well, as believers, we need to be having 2020 vision on the biblical prophets, on the Torah, on Messiah, on his teachings, on Paul's teachings, on the letters of the New Testament, on the book of Revelation. We need to be understanding these things as a church, as a community of Jew and Gentile, coming together as the one new man, the one new body, to go into this next decade. So friends, I hope this has been helpful to you. Until next time, may God bless you. May He keep you. May His face shine upon you and give you His grace. May He lift up His countenance upon you and give you His everlasting shalom. My name is Chadwick, and this is Faithful Performance.